The warp storm raged above Varkulo's prime like a wound that refused to close. For 7 days it had churned across the ghoul sector, not simply a weather of the void, but a living violence, a tide of broken reality that scraped at the sky and made the stars look sick. Over Hive Sanctus Var the clouds burned in colors no human throat had ever named, bruised crimson and poisoned violet, bleeding into each other as the Imperium pressed against the world below. Lightning crawled sideways through the haze, slow and deliberate, as if the storm were thinking. Before we descend into the chaos of this tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more legends and dark histories from the Warhammer 40K universe. Down in the Manufactorum belts, machines screamed as their spirits died. Conveyor lines shuddered without command. Furnace mouths coughed black fire. Steel gantries trembled like bones in a giant's hand. Every alarm in the hive had long since melted into one endless wail, a grief too loud to become background. The air tasted of promethium and iron dust. Each breath carried the same message. Something old had come back to collect what was owed. The city moved beneath that sky like a creature already halfway buried. Millions clung to corridors and under habs, packed into tunnels of rockcrete and rust, praying in 1,000 broken dialects to a distant emperor who did not answer with words. Their devotion rose in heat and sweat, in candles burning low in alcoves, in hands shaking around cheap icons, in the soft whisper of litany that tried to make terror manageable. Faith was the hive's last wall, and each new tremor in the ground made it thinner. At the outer bastions, guardsmen held firing lines against shapes that should not exist. Demons flickered out of corrupted machines, their bodies half smoke and half blade. Cultists ran laughing through the smoke, skin tattooed with sigils that crawled when no one watched. Bolter flashes strobed against gargoyle spires. Artillery thunder rolled through hive levels like a heartbeat failing. Somewhere far below in the Forge cathedrals, an entire district had already gone dark, swallowed by the storm's spill. Above it all, the warp did not merely howl. It listened, and then it shifted. The storm's eye pulled inward for one slow breath and flared again, brighter, tighter, like a predator turning toward a sound it could not place. The pressure in the air changed. Not the choking weight of the Imperium, but a different gravity, clean and sharpened, the kind that comes from a will that has decided. Servitors in mid-flight stalled and fell. Vox channels hissed to static. Even the demons hesitated, their rage stuttering as if something in the world had spoken a language older than the warp. High over the central forge complex, reality tore the way parchment tears when gripped too hard. There was no portal frame, no ritual circle, only a sudden vertical rip in the sky. A streak of light dropped through, not a meteor and not a pod, but the silhouette of a man falling like he had chosen the path. Wind hammered past red hair and a dark cloak. One hand rested on a sword hilt as though the descent were a walk across calm planks. The face remained steady, eyes narrowed not with fear but with alert curiosity, reading a battlefield before boots touched ground. Shanks entered this galaxy without ceremony. The storm received him like an insult. Air and ash swirled outward from the impact point, rolling over ferrocrete roofs in gray waves. Sparks cascaded from broken conduits. The hive below felt the landing in its bones, a single new beat inside the old dying rhythm. In that breath, the night did not end, but it changed. The warp had opened its mouth to devour another world, and instead swallowed a presence it did not understand. The red-haired captain rose into the blood-colored glow, sword still sheathed, calm settling around his shoulders like a tide going slack, and the world held still just long enough to. Varkulo's prime had never been a gentle world. Even before the storm, its horizon was a wall of smoke and iron, a planet built to feed fleets that would never stop going to war. The shipyard forges spread across continents like welded cities, their skeletal cranes rising into poisoned sky, their dry docks large enough to swallow capital ships whole. Beneath those colossal lattices sat Hive Sanctus Var, a vertical mountain of living labor, tier upon tier of habitation, stacked over the old bedrock like a monument to survival through exhaustion. Everything here was made to endure, yet endurance had limits when the warp decided to lean close. Shanks moved along the broken roofline of the central manufactorum, drawn forward by the pull of suffering threaded through the air. Each step carried a faint tremor underfoot, the hive's nerves reacting to battles below. Observation Haki brushed across the world in quiet pulses, not searching for power alone, but for shape and intent. What returned was a storm of fear and belief, layered over something worse, a hunger that did not belong to mortal minds. This place was not simply under attack, it was being rewritten. Far beneath, the forge belts had become rivers of corruption. Assembly lines once devoted to sacred labor now bucked and twisted, their machine spirits silent or screaming. From cracked conveyor housings, claws and brass sinew emerged, demons wading out of steel intestines as if the factories were birthing pits. Each time a flickering form found 3 heartbeats of stability, it turned toward the nearest living body, driven by instinct older than language. Sparks rained down on the foundry floors like falling ash, and the metal itself seemed to recoil from what walked across it. Imperial Guard formations held where they could, thin lines of men and women behind barricades welded from scrap. Their lasfire stitched red lines through haze, cutting down cultists and lesser horrors by the dozen. Yet numbers meant little against enemies that did not tire, did not fear, did not require breath. Every minute a section of wall fell. Every hour another regiment was forced backward into narrower streets where retreat became a slaughterhouse. The tide was not a wave so much as slow drowning, patient and total. Mechanicus forces fought in their own way. Tech priests climbed gantries wreathed in incense and static, chanting binaric rites to cages of malfunctioning reactors. Skidare marched in precise squares through smoke so thick it would choke unaugmented lungs in seconds, galvanic rifles spitting blue death into demon swarms. Servoskulls swarmed overhead like carrion birds, relaying data, marking targets, and sometimes igniting into blessed explosions when corners were lost. Even with their faith in steel and ritual, the red logic of the Adeptus Mechanicus bent under the storm's pressure. Systems failed in cascading patterns that felt less like error and more like malice. From the underhabs, the city's buried grief rose to meet the invasion. Cultists spilled out of drainage tunnels and collapsed transit shafts, faces painted in ash and blood, mouths chanting words that peeled sanity from anyone who heard. Some carried rusted auto guns, others only knives and fervor. The storm had found their anger, had turned it into a flame, and now they ran toward the light of burning forges as if toward salvation. Wherever they passed, fear became a doorway. Wherever they died, the warp gained another foothold. Shanks felt the pattern with calm certainty. This was not a battle that could be won by holding ground alone. The Imperium here was vast, disciplined, courageous, yet trapped inside a war of attrition against an enemy that fed on the very act of resistance. Even from above, the drift of collapse was visible, a slow retreat spiraling inward toward the hive's heart. Another hour, and the shipyard forges would be fully lost. Another hour after that, and Sanctus Var would become a beacon for fleets of ruin. The storm sang over all of it, satisfied and waiting, while the red-haired captain listened to the dying rhythm of the world and kept moving, carrying the quiet sense that the next steps would decide more than a city's fate. Colonel Radic had learned long ago that war on a hive world was not fought across open fields, but through corridors of steel and belief. The outer bastions of Sanctus Var were built like the teeth of some ancient beast, layered walls of ferrocrete studded with macro guns and kill zones that had broken a dozen Xenos raids over centuries. Now those defenses were bleeding, not from lack of discipline, but from the kind of enemy that treated every barrier as an invitation. The Krieg colonel stood in a trench cut into the upper manufactorum approach, coat stiff with soot and dried blood, respirator filters ticking softly as they fought to keep the air drinkable. From this line, the hive's spine was visible in jagged silhouettes. Towers rose into sick light, their stained-glass saints shattered by artillery shock. Void shields flickered in unstable sheets over distant districts, each failure announcing another place where the storm had bitten through. Shanks, moving across the broken roofline above, felt Radix' presence before seeing him. The colonel's mind was a blade of cold endurance, sharpened by years of knowing that survival was optional while duty was not. There was no panic there, only calculation, the steady refusal to collapse before the world finished collapsing. Radix Vox network was a choir of bad news. Grid positions that had been held at dawn were now marked dead. Patrol routes were turning into ambush funnels lined with butchered squads. Auspex returns showed demon clusters multiplying near the shipyard forges, their signatures swelling like infection across the map. The Mechanicus had anchored their skitara in the Forge Cathedral, but even that shrine of machine faith was trembling under the warp's pressure. Every report ended the same way, a request for reinforcements that did not exist. Reserves had already been spent, bled into rubble streets and furnace halls. The colonel listened without flinching, accepting each loss like a weight added to a pack already too heavy to lift. Fire erupted across the no-man's land below. Cultists surged from a collapsed transit tunnel, sprinting through smoke with autoguns clutched like relics. Behind them, demon shapes shivered into matter, brass and shadow dragged into reality by the corruption soaking the machines. The line answered with lasfire in disciplined volleys. Red beams carved the haze, dropping bodies in heaps that steamed on hot metal. Yet for every cultist that fell, two more climbed over the dead, and the demons advanced through the killing field as if pain were only a rumor. Radix raised a power sword that had been blessed more times than it had been sharpened. Orders came short and flat through his throat mic, not dramatic, not hopeful, only correct. Third platoon rotated to cover the breach. Artillery adjusted 5 degrees east. Medici triage shifted back one corridor. The voice was steady and low, a metronome around which frightened soldiers could align their breathing. The line did not break because the colonel would not allow his own will to break first. Shanks watched from above, feeling the rhythm of that stubborn defense. The Imperium here was not noble the way old songs imagined, yet there was a brutal beauty in men who stood in open fire for a cause larger than their bodies. The red-haired captain did not know their emperor, but could sense what devotion did to a soul under pressure. It made fear useful instead of paralyzing. It made retreat feel like betrayal. Beneath the storm, Radix' line held not because victory was likely, but because surrender was impossible. That quiet refusal radiated upward, touching something in Shanks that understood seas that never forgave weakness, and battles that decided who pulled the next breath. The night's weight pressed down, and the next tremor of fate gathered above the hive. The storm had been angry when Shanks arrived, but anger was simple compared to what came next. Above the Forge Cathedral, the roiling cloud deck tightened into a spiral, as if the warp were pulling itself into a fist. Air pressure dropped fast enough to make lungs sting. The hive's lights dimmed in a city-wide flicker, then surged back in sick pulses that made the streets look like a failing heart on a monitor. Shanks felt it first as a shift in the breath of the world, a sudden hush beneath the noise, the way sea creatures stop singing when a predator swims overhead. From the roofline, the sky looked thin and wrong. Colors bled together in bands that hurt to watch, and lightning ran in slow loops rather than strikes. It was not weather. It was will, a foreign will scraping against reality to find a seam. The seam tore open without warning, a vertical slit in the cloud mass that glowed like exposed nerve. Wind screamed outward from it, dragging ash and debris into the air in a widening circle. For one suspended moment, there was silence, the kind that makes every instinct line forward. The warp eye widened. Through it, Shanks glimpsed nothing that could be named as place. There were shapes moving behind the light, impossible geometries that spun and inverted, like thoughts divorced from flesh. The pressure it gave off was ancient rage and hungry laughter, the same note that had filled the underhabs with cultist fever. Yet threaded through that roar was something new, a faint crackle of curiosity, as though the storm had noticed an unfamiliar flavor on its tongue and wished to taste more. Below, soldiers felt the change even if they did not understand it. Guardsmen along Radix line faltered mid-reload, staring upward through smoke. Skitarai targeting reticles jittered as Auspex arrays tried to lock on to distances that had stopped behaving. Sirens wailed differently, their tones spiking erratically as the hive's machine spirits shivered. Some citizens dropped to their knees in corridors far away, believing a saint had come. Others screamed the opposite, believing damnation had finally found their door. Faith and fear braided together into a single trembling thread that ran through the city's bones. Shanks stood still, not out of awe, but because stillness was sometimes the best way to read a storm. Observation Haki brushed the rift's edges. What it found was not a mind that could be spoken to, but a tide of raw intent, full of malice and appetite, pressing down with the slow certainty of gravity. That pressure wanted souls. It wanted the city's suffering to become a gateway wide enough for a greater hunger to step through. The red-haired captain sensed the direction of that intent, the way it was aiming itself at the forged cathedral like a spearpoint toward the heart. The rift convulsed and something fell from it, not a meteor, not a demon, not a craft. It was a silhouette wrapped in light, descending fast but controlled, as if the fall were a chosen movement rather than a punishment. Shanks felt the moment the storm recognized the fall as well. The warp eye flared brighter, tightening around the descending figure, tasting it the way fire tastes air. A ripple went through the immaterium like surprise, then deepened into the restless promise of a new contest. Wind slammed the roofline. Shanks steadied against it, cloak snapping behind like a sail catching sudden gale, eyes narrowed under calm certainty. Whatever the rift had thrown down was a turning point, either another blade for the storm's hand or a wedge driven into its throat. The rift kept widening, waiting to see which, and the hive held its breath with it. Impact came like a hammer made of light. The falling figure struck the forged cathedral roof hard enough to crater ferrocrete and scatter twisted steel across the upper levels. Ash rolled outward in gray rings. Sparks rained down into the forge hall through ruptured vents, hissing as they died on heated metal. For a heartbeat, the world did not know what it had received. Then the dust thinned, and Shanks stood within the crater like a man who had stepped from one deck to another during a stormy night at sea. Red hair fell across his shoulders, bright against the soot. A dark cloak settled behind in slow folds, more weary than dramatic, the fabric catching stray embers as if they were fireflies. Griffin remained sheathed at his side, hand resting lightly on the hilt with the relaxed readiness of a swordsman who never has to hurry. The face looked forward with quiet appraisal, not shocked by the alien skyline, not frightened by the blood-colored glare overhead. This was not the first impossible place he had walked into. It was only the first that smelled so much like a nation failing in real time. The new sky felt wrong to him, not simply because of its color, but because the pressure in it came from something that fed on pain, something vast enough that even hard men below called it a god. Shanks tasted that pressure as a low hum in the air, like thunder waiting behind the clouds. It was different from the seas he knew, different from the Grand Line's cruelty, yet the rhythm was familiar. Power here was ancient, divided, and hungry. It turned people into weapons, then threw those weapons away. Observation Haki widened gently. The hive unfolded below like a vertical ocean. Up top, bastions and gun nests glared red with muzzle flashes. Mid-levels burned in clusters where demons had breached. Down deep, shadows writhed with cultist movement, a tide searching for weak spots to enter. Each living mind was a faint lantern, some steady, some flickering, many already snuffed. The strongest lights belonged to soldiers holding lines against odds that should have broken them. One cold beacon in particular marked the outer trench, a will as rigid as iron, refusing to bend. Radek, though the name meant nothing to Shanks yet, felt like a cliff that waves could batter but not move. The air around the crater quivered. Shanks sensed the warp eye above narrowing again, like a pupil focusing. It was watching. The storm had not given him passage by accident. Whether it had swallowed him and spat him out, or whether some deeper current had dragged him here, the the result was the same. A stranger stood in a war that had no map for him, and the world waited to see which way the stranger lined. He stepped to the crater's edge and looked out over the forge belts. The manufactorum halls below churned with ember light and screaming metal. In the distance, cranes as tall as mountains loomed over dry docks that had become graveyards. The scale was monstrous, yet the suffering was intimate. Each scream rising from beneath was a person counting final seconds. Each explosion a home erased. Each prayer a hand reaching for something that might not be listening anymore. Shanks breathed in once, slow and level. Calm was not weakness. Calm was the only way to cut through chaos without becoming it. A quiet decision formed with the steadiness of tides. Whatever had brought him here, the first truth was simple. A storm was eating this hive alive. A captain did not walk away from a ship that was sinking when hands were still on deck. With that certainty settling like weight into his stance, he moved toward the broken roof vents, ready to descend into the forge halls where the first enemies waited. Heat rose from the wounded roof like breath from a furnace throat. Shanks dropped through a torn vent shaft into the manufactorum interior, landing lightly on a catwalk slick with oil and blood. Below, assembly lines twisted in spasms, their belts jerking as if trying to tear themselves apart. Furnace light painted everything in dirty gold. Shadows stuttered between pillars. Sound was a constant grind of machinery dying the wrong way, punctuated by distant bolter thumps and the thin law's hiss of men trying to keep edges from collapsing. The first demon revealed itself in a burst of sparks. It crawled up from a cracked, smelting vat, brass hide steaming as it met air. Another followed, then three more, gathering in a loose pack with axes that looked forged from violence, not metal. Their forms were lean and brutal, all horn and blade and hunger, eyes burning with a kind of joy that belonged only to things that did not fear death. They were not cautious. They were not strategic. They were appetite given legs. Shanks felt their presence as a pressure against the mind, a push that tried to make everything inside boil into rage. Yet rage without direction was just noise, and his will did not bend to noise. Observation, Haki read their movement before it fully formed. The angle of shoulders, the tightening of grip on their axes, the way their feet set on the grating. Small tells, even in creatures like these, because every fighter carried a rhythm. The red-haired captain met that rhythm with his own. Griffin slid from its sheath in a single quiet line. Armament, Haki coated the blade, not visible as light, but felt as density, as if the sword had taken on the weight of a mountain's resolve. The first demon lunged across the catwalk. Shanks stepped once to the side, blade moving in a clean arc that opened the creature from collar to hip. The body burst into smoking ichor, evaporating into ash that fell through the grates in slow flakes. Two more leapt together, a clumsy attempt at overwhelming through speed. Shanks turned the cut into a flowing second motion, parrying the first axe with the sword's flat and letting the second swing pass through empty air. The counter was small, almost lazy, yet devastating. Griffin flicked once, severing a wrist, then the throat. The demon's head dropped soundlessly, dissolving before it struck the floor. The pack pressed closer, sensing that something about this mortal was wrong. No warp scent clung to him, yet their instincts screamed danger. One tried to circle, claws scraping metal. Another charged mid-level, horns lowered. Conqueror's Haki uncoiled in response, not as a shout but as a pressure spreading through the hall like a deep ocean current. The weakest demons faltered, their bodies shivering as if their own rage had turned against them. The charge broke not because fear owned them, but because Shanks will simply crushed theirs under a greater weight. Axe heads clattered from limp hands. One demon dropped to its knees, snarling at nothing, then collapsed into vapor. Another stumbled backward, attempting to retreat toward the furnace mouth that had birthed it, only to be cut down by a single forward step and a decisive slash that ended the question. Silence returned in fragments. The manufactorum still screamed, but the immediate hunger was gone. Shanks lowered the blade slightly, eyes scanning the shadows for the next breath of threat. The storm overhead had given him no time to choose a gentle entry. The galaxy wanted to know if he belonged among its predators or its prey. The first answer lay smoking at his feet, and deeper answers were already moving through the forge halls toward him. The forge hall did not stay quiet for long. Demon blood evaporated into greasy smoke, and that smoke carried the scent of violence further into the Manufactorum's maze. Shanks moved forward along the catwalk, not rushing, simply following the current of threat. Each step was measured, each breath steady. The blade remained in hand, angled low, ready without being eager. A master did not waste strength on posture. Strength was saved for moments that needed it. Below the catwalk, iron skeletons of half-built war machines hung from cranes, swaying gently in the wind that leaked through shattered walls. The sight pressed a bitter thought into Shanks' mind, a world that built giant ships and weapons endlessly, yet still could not protect its own people from being devoured by darkness. It was a familiar tragedy. Empires grew fat on steel, then forgot the human reasons they had built steel in the first place. Another cluster of demons burst from a conveyor line ahead. These were not bloodletters alone, but a mix of lesser warp creatures, too thin to be called strong, too savage to be ignored. They climbed toward the catwalk from broken stairwells, claws setting sparks to the metal. Their advance was noisy and eager, like sharks tasting blood in water. Shanks watched them come, eyes calm, mind already in motion. Sword skill here meant more than speed. It meant understanding terrain, weight, and timing. The catwalk narrowed to a choke point between two furnace chimneys. Shanks took that ground without thinking about it, because fighters who live long learn to let the world offer its own advantages. The first demon reached the choke, swinging wide. Griffin met the blow with a short parry, steel guided by armament Haki, that made the impact feel like a mountain refusing to move. The counter slash came in the same breath, cutting through brass hide and bone alike. The corpse dissolved before balance could be lost. Another leapt from below, aiming to land behind. Observation Haki brushed the intent a heartbeat earlier. Shanks pivoted, cloak turning with him, and delivered a reverse cut that split the creature midair. It fell in two fading pieces, scattering embers as it hit the grating. Two more came together, axes high. The captains slipped inside their arc. The blade did not swing wide. It stabbed once through a sternum, then swept upward into the second throat, tight and economical, like a sailor tying knots in a storm. The demons began to hesitate, not from mercy, but from confusion. Mortal bodies were supposed to tire. Mortal minds were supposed to fracture under fear. This one moved as if fear were a tool, not a master. Their aggression turned disorganized. Shanks exploited that without cruelty, only with necessity. A feint drew one demon to overcommit. A step to the left opened a line for a cut that severed legs at the knee. Another tried to retreat and was ended with a single clean strike across the spine. No wasted motion, no flourish, only correctness. Griffin's edge was not simply slicing flesh. With Haki riding along it, the sword cut through the essence binding these creatures to reality. Each kill felt like cutting a rope that tethered something hateful to the world, and Shanks felt that rope snap and recoil into the warp with every falling body. Far below, guardsmen fighting in the lower aisles caught glimpses of the red-haired figure above. Each time a demon died, the pressure in their minds eased slightly. A few found enough breath to fire straighter. A few found enough courage to hold their footing a little longer. Shanks did not seek their gaze, yet sensed their hope rising anyway, and it settled quietly against the shoulders like an extra weight worth carrying. When the last demon dissipated, the forge hall did not brighten, but it felt less poisoned. The captain paused at the catwalk's edge, letting observation Haki spread wider through the maze. More threats were coming. Not only demons, but minds that carried discipline, cruelty, and long war experience. The first waves had been hunger. The next would be strategy. Shanks tightened grip on Griffin, feeling the calm in his chest sharpen into readiness, and stepped toward the deeper corridors where the real test waited, leaving the forge's dying screams behind like a soft, inevitable handoff into the next storm. The deeper Manufactorum tunnels widened into a sorting hall where the air pulsed with heat and warp pressure. Shanks stepped into it and felt the difference at once. The demons here were not simply lingering predators. They were anchored by something stronger. A knot of immaterium seeped into the floor plates and the overhead cranes, turning the whole chamber into a mouth that wanted to bite. The hall's walls were lined with half-melted icons of the Emperor, their faces warped into expressionless sorrow. The machinery no longer groaned like dying beasts. It whispered in a language of malice. A new pack surfaced from the corrupted assembly trenches, larger than before. Brass axes dragged along the grating so the sound carried like a threat. Their eyes locked on the red-haired captain, and their presence pushed a wave of raw rage into the air, trying to force his blood into a boil. It was the same trick the warp used on mortals: provoke the heart until the mind cracked and the soul opened like a door. The pressure rolled outward through the hall, spilling into side passages where exhausted guardsmen were fighting for inches of ground. Men who had stood firm a moment earlier began to tremble, fingers tightening too hard on triggers. Somewhere down a corridor, a frightened civilian screamed and turned on a neighbor without knowing why. Shanks felt that tide touch his own chest. The warp wanted anger to be sloppy, loud, and endless, yet the anger inside him had long since been forged into a blade, cold enough to cut without shaking. Conqueror's Haki rose under his breath like a quiet ocean swell. It did not explode. It expanded, slow and patient, an invisible crown of will that settled over the hall and forced every lesser presence to acknowledge it. The nearest demons faltered. Their feet skid across the metal as if the floor had tilted against them. Their axes dipped. A few snarled and tried to push forward anyway, but the force of Shanks' spirit pressed them down with suffocating weight. Even warp-born hunger had to recognize a superior will when it met one, and this will was not desperate or frantic. It was mature authority, the kind that had stared down sea kings and emperors without lowering its gaze. One demon lunged in blind defiance. Shanks cut it mid-step, the blade sliding through brass hide with armament Haki driving the edge into the creature's binding core. The body cracked into ash, and the rest broke apart in hesitation. Some tried to retreat toward the trenches they had climbed from. Conqueror's Haki tightened instead, not cruelly, only decisively. A wave passed through them like sudden nightfall. Several collapsed where they stood, their forms losing cohesion, peeling away into smoke that curled upward and vanished into the hall's stained rafters. The rage that had been flooding the air ebbed almost immediately. Guardsmen down the corridor blinked as if waking from fever. Their grips loosened, their hearts steadied. They did not know why relief had come, only that it had, and that the pressure now belonged to someone else. Shanks watched the last demon dissolve, feeling the warp recoil around his presence in something close to irritation. This galaxy was used to conquering souls through despair. It was not used to a man who could dominate the room without warp gifts or prayers. The sorting hall remained a war zone, but the air had shifted. A quiet space opened in the storm's rhythm, a small clearing carved by will alone. Shanks stepped through it toward the next corridor, sensing heavier minds approaching, minds that would not fold under Conqueror's pressure so easily. The first taste of the warp had met a rival tide, and the sea ahead was growing darker. From the upper gallery, Tech Priest Dominus Ler9 observed through lenses that multiplied reality into cold layers of data. Mechadendrites hung like steel vines over the railing, each one tipped with a different sensor, blessed by rights older than the hive itself. The sorting hall below was a grid of numbers to him: temperature, pressure, movement vectors, warp contamination levels. Those numbers had always told simple stories. Demons bled warp. Psychers flared in predictable patterns. Corruption left measurable scars. The figure walking calmly through the storm's center was telling none of those stories, and that fact felt dangerous. Ler9 Auspex arrays returned null where there should have been psychic burn. No mutation markers, no warp resonance bands. Yet whenever the stranger released that invisible pressure, several demons collapsed without physical contact, and nearby soldiers staggered as if crushed by a gravity field. The machine logic had no slot for such an event. Imperial doctrine called it psychic dominance, but psychic dominance worked through the warp, leaving residue like smoke. This dominance left only silence in its wake. Binary canticles hummed under Lur-9 breath, not as prayer, but as the closest thing to focus. A memory of ancient archives surfaced through his cogitator implants, fragments about pre-imperial mental disciplines, about shaping matter without immaterium vectors. The idea was heresy in some data loops, myth in others, yet the hall below was proof walking on two legs. The sword strokes, the timing, the way enemies seemed to slow before they reached him, none of it matched sanctioned psyker profiles. The weapon itself was old-fashioned, a simple blade, except every cut carried a density that let it rupture demon essence in ways even power fields struggled to achieve. Lur-9 opened an encrypted Vox channel to Colonel Radek's command trench. Words came steady and low, filtered through static and incense vapor. Unknown human combatant active in Central Manufactorum. Displays dominance effect not derived from warp. Threat to asset ratio indeterminate. Recommend caution and observation rather than immediate containment. In the Vox pause that followed, the tech priest felt something unfamiliar in his own chest cavity. Not fear, not faith. Curiosity sharp enough to ache. Below, guardsmen were beginning to look upward between volleys, searching for the source of the sudden breathing room. Lur-9 tracked their morale curves rising, their firing lanes tightening into renewed discipline. The stranger had become a moving anchor. The logic of war made that valuable, but the logic of the Imperium made anything unclassified a potential infection. The Dominus knew the Inquisition would demand a name, a label, a chain of authority. None of those things existed yet for the red-haired swordsman who had dropped from a storm like a correction to fate. Lur-9 kept watching, recording everything with clinical devotion. Each step the stranger took into deeper corridors forced the machine mind to accept a new variable in the war. The Manufactorum was still collapsing outward, yet around that variable, the pattern shifted. Lur-9 did not know whether to call it anomaly or omen, only that the Imperium had not planned for it, and chaos had not expected it. The data streams rolled onward, and the Priest of Steel waited for the next spike that would reveal what kind of storm this man truly was. The next spike came with the sound of marching armor, not the frantic scramble of cultists, not the skitter of demons, but heavy, measured footfalls that belonged to warriors who had learned patience over centuries of siege. Shanks felt them before seeing them, a cluster of minds approaching through the Manufactorum's eastern artery. Their presence pressed cold and bitter against the senses, not wild rage but disciplined hatred, like iron left too long in fire. These were not creatures birthed by a storm. They were men who had chosen the storm and lived inside it. Steam veiled the eastern approach, venting from ruptured pipes in thick white curtains. Through that haze came the silhouettes of iron warriors, power armor scarred and layered with brass sigils, bolters carried low but ready. Their helmets tracked every corridor angle with methodical sweeps. Each step was a calculation. They did not rush toward noise. They moved to seal space, to dominate geometry, to turn a city into a trap. The Manufactorum had been their kind of battlefield long before Varculo's Prime was even born. The lead marine paused at a junction where conveyor belts crossed like ribs. Bloodletters lay scattered there, fading residue of Shanks' earlier passage. The marine studied the remains without surprise, only with interest, and the Vox chatter among them tightened into short tactical bursts. They had come expecting cultists and guard. They had found something that cut demons apart with surgical economy. That made it either a threat to be eliminated or a prize to be claimed. Shanks stepped into view at the far end of the junction, cloak stirring in the furnace wind. Griffin hung at his side, edge dark with evaporating ichor. The Iron Warrior saw a lone human framed by industrial firelight. Their logic said such a figure should be dead within seconds. Their experience warned that survivors standing alone in a slaughter corridor were rarely simple prey. Bolters lifted in unison, targeting runes flared. The first volley tore down the corridor, mass-reactive shells screaming through steam and ash. Shanks did not flinch. Observation Haki caught the trajectory lines as if they were threads pulled tight across the air. Feet shifted half a step. The blade rose. The corridor became a narrow sea of incoming steel and detonations, and in that sea, timing was everything. The Iron Warriors advanced behind their own fire, disciplined enough to treat the volleys as moving cover. Their minds were hard, their souls scarred by 10,000 years of war in the warp's shadow. This was not a clash of amateurs. It was a collision between two kinds of mastery, one forged on the Grand Line, the other in the Long War. The Manufactorum itself trembled as if aware that something important had entered its arteries. Behind them, cultists surged in their wake, encouraged by the Marines' presence. Demons crawled along overhead gantries, drawn by the sound of bolters and the taste of violence. The corridor narrowed into a single brutal funnel that led straight toward Shanks. The galaxy had raised a new tier of opposition, and the next answer would be written in ceramite shards and fading warp smoke. Steel met steel in the air before flesh could. Griffin moved in tight arcs, not wide swings, each motion guided by a calm that felt almost like sleep. Armament Haki coated the blade, hardening it beyond ordinary metal, giving it a density that answered bolter rounds with clean deflections instead of shattering impact. Each shell struck the sword's edge and flicked away, detonating against girders or chewing craters into conveyor housings. Sparks burst like brief constellations. The corridor filled with thunder, yet Shanks stayed centered inside it, reading the rhythm of fire the way a captain reads waves. Bolter volleys came in patterns, staggered and overlapping, designed to saturate a target's defense. The Iron Warriors were siege masters. Their doctrine assumed that anything could be pinned by enough explosive steel. The red-haired captain did not attempt to stop every round. Observation Haki picked the lethal lines, the ones that mattered. A parry here, a tilt of the blade there, a shift of shoulder that let a shell pass so close it tore cloth without touching skin. The rest he allowed to fly, not out of arrogance, but because the human body only had so many movements in a breath, and wasting them meant dying. The corridor's walls became a storm of secondary explosions. Chunks of ferrocrete spat outward. Crane hooks fell from overhead chains. A servoarm snapped and crashed into a belt line, sending shards of hot metal into the air like shrapnel rain. Shanks let the chaos happen around him, using it as cover against the next volley. A step behind a falling gantry, a turn through a cloud of steam, then back into open lane before the Marines could adjust aim. The movement was fluid and economical, a blade cutting through a blizzard by refusing to fight the blizzard directly. A shell finally slipped past the sword's arc, exploding against his shoulder, the impact throwing sparks across the cloak. Pain registered, sharp but brief, then folded into focus. Armament Haki was not armor in the way these Marines understood armor. It did not form a shell around him. It reinforced intent, strengthened living tissue where Will placed it. The next round that would have taken his ribs struck a forearm hardened by Haki and glanced away, detonating harmlessly into the floor. The Iron Warriors slowed. Their firing discipline remained, but their certainty began to grind. The corridor mathematics were failing. Sensors said the human should be down. Experience said the human was advancing through their fire like a tide that had stopped being impressed by storms. Their souls carried bitterness like rust, yet even rust could be cut apart if the edge was true. Shanks felt the moment their cadence shifted. A Marine on the left reloaded. Another adjusted to a flanking angle. A third began to step forward for a chain blade rush, trusting in ceramite and hatred to close the distance. The captain's blade lowered slightly, breath steady. Bolter fire was not the real danger. The real danger was the space between firing lines, where disciplined killers intended to turn his body into a lesson. Shanks stepped into that space with the same quiet certainty that had carried him through countless impossibilities, and the corridor tightened around the coming clash. The first Iron Warrior to commit to melee came like a collapsing wall. Chainblade roared, teeth spinning with demon-hungry malice. Shanks waited until the last heartbeat, then slid to the side in one clean motion. Griffin kissed the Chainblade's housing, armament Haki driving the edge through ceramite layers that should have resisted any mortal sword. Sparks sprayed across the Marine's chest plate. The Chainblade died in a shriek of torn gears, and before the warrior could shift to a follow-up punch, a second cut open the shoulder seam and sent a gauntleted arm dropping heavy to the floor. Two Marines fired at near point-blank range, trying to drown him in explosive steel. Shanks bent low and moved through the gap between shots, not faster than light, simply earlier than expectation. Observation, Haki read their intent before fingers tightened on triggers. Griffin rose in a short diagonal arc, splitting the nearest bolter muzzle and cutting through the helm beneath. The Marine fell without sound, body already beginning to slump as the sword slid free. Another Iron Warrior swung a power fist toward his ribs. Shanks met it with the flat of the blade, then redirected the force into a turn that carried him past the Marine's flank. A thrust followed, aimed at the joint under the arm where ceramite met softer plating. Haki rode the point like a silent thunderclap. The sword pierced cleanly. The Marine staggered, then collapsed, Vox static spilling from his helm as life signs dimmed. The rest tightened formation. Their minds were cold and old, yet surprise had entered their blood. They could not lock onto his presence the way they locked onto ordinary targets. Each time they recalculated, he was already in the space their sensors had labeled safe. The corridor became a dance of brutal geometry, Marines shifting to cover angles, while Shanks slipped between angles like water finding cracks in a dam. A Marine behind a support pillar tried to flank. Shanks sensed the breath of that intent without turning his head. Conqueror's Haki flicked outward in a narrow wave, not to crush souls, only to freeze motion for a fraction long enough to decide the exchange. The flanker's body faltered mid-step, and Griffin's backhand slash took the helm rim and throat beneath in one fluid line. The corpse slid down the pillar, armor clanging against metal like a bell in a dead chapel. Bolters kept firing, but their lines were breaking into panic bursts. The Iron Warriors were not cowards, yet even veterans could feel the edge of helplessness when doctrine failed. Shanks pressed forward without cruelty. Each strike was measured, aimed at disabling first, killing only where resistance demanded it. He did not taunt, he did not chase. The sword simply moved where the battle needed it to move. When the last Marine fell back into the steam, the corridor was littered with smoking armor pieces and the sharp smell of superheated metal. Shanks stood amid the ruin, cloak settling, blade angled low. The forge halls were quieter here now, yet deeper within the manufactorum. Heavier steps were already approaching. This had been strategy meeting mastery, and somewhere ahead waited foes who would not rely on bolters alone. The captain drew a slow breath, feeling the war's tide reforming in the dark, and moved onward with the soft weight of inevitability gathering around the next doorway. The corridor opened into a wider transit nave where the manufactorum's internal roads converged. Here the fighting had momentarily thinned. Shattered servoarms hung from the ceiling, twitching lazily in broken loops. A dozen burnt-out hab doors lay smashed against the walls, turned into makeshift barricades by hands that no longer had the strength to build anything better. Smoke drifted in slow layers, and through it came the staggered shapes of Imperial soldiers pulling back to regroup. Shanks lowered Griffin as the first squad appeared. Their uniforms were gray and dust-heavy, coats torn by shrapnel, rebreathers crusted with soot. Lasguns stayed in their hands, muzzles angled low but ready, the way disciplined men hold weapons when fear is high but orders are higher. Observation Haki brushed across them and returned a simple truth. These were not cultists. Their hearts were taut with dread, yet their will was still pinned to duty, like sailors staying at a sinking helm, because the sea did not care about panic. A lieutenant emerged from the line, helm under one arm, face cut with grime and exhaustion. The man's thoughts carried a battle map, a chain of command, and a sharp alarm at the unclassified stranger standing amid fallen Chaos Marines. Steps slowed as the chessboard formed in his mind. A lone swordsman, red hair, no visible armor, yet surrounded by ceramic corpses and evaporating demons. Not a sight any drilled doctrine prepared for. The lieutenant spoke with careful control, words steady and low, trying to keep the squad aligned to regulation. Identity and allegiance required. No formal salute came, yet there was a subtle respect in the distance kept, like a gun crew addressing a weapon they did not fully understand. Shanks listened without tension. The question was fair. In a world like this, anything unknown could be a plague disguised as a man. A soft reply came from him with calm certainty, name offered simply, no title demanded. The tone carried no threat, only quiet authority. The lieutenant blinked, searching memory for this name in Imperial logs and finding nothing. Soldiers behind shifted feet, fingers tightening on triggers for a heartbeat, then easing as the air around the red-haired captain remained calm instead of predatory. Fear was still there, but curiosity was beginning to rise through it, the way light finds cracks in storm cloud. From deeper passages, more guardsmen arrived, drawn by the sudden lull and the sight of their enemies cut down in silence. Some carried wounded on stretchers made of scrap, some knelt near fallen comrades and murmured litanies before moving on. Each passing mind brushed against Shanks like a tide of devotion to a distant emperor. The faith felt massive, burning in these mortals even as their bodies frayed, and it shaped how they looked at him. Not as a savior, not yet, but as a blade that might fit into their war if it did not turn in their hand. Shanks spoke again, asking not for praise, but for the shape of this conflict, for the name of the world and the power it served. The lieutenant answered with an instinctive catechism, telling of the Emperor of mankind, of his light and his war, because that was the only lens through which these soldiers knew how to explain survival. The words were not dramatic. They were the same steady belief soldiers used to keep their knees firm while the sky cracked open. Shanks absorbed the meaning, sensing that their emperor was not a man in a palace, but a symbol holding a million worlds together through sheer gravity of belief. It was a system he understood, even if the names were different. Somewhere inside the hive, another tremor rolled, and distant screams climbed the shafts toward a new crescendo. The lieutenant's eyes flicked toward that sound, then back to the red-haired captain, waiting to see if this stranger was ally, threat, or something beyond both. Shanks gave a small nod, and the soldiers felt it like permission to breathe, stepping aside as the tide of battle pulled everyone toward the next disaster. Moving with the guard through the transit nave, Shanks let observation Haki expand gently, tasting the city the way a navigator tastes wind before choosing a course. Sanctus Var unfolded in layers of suffering. The upper levels smelled of burning train lines and chemical smoke. Mid-levels were drowning under cultist surges. Downhabs had already become a maze of slaughter and whispers. Yet threaded through all of it was something consistent, a devotion so heavy it had become part of the hive's air. Every soldier he passed carried that devotion in a different shape. Some wore it like armor, hard and unwavering. Some clung to it like a small flame held between trembling hands. None of it felt false. Their emperor was real to them in the way the sea is real to sailors, not because they can touch it, but because it dictates every step they take. Even now, with the storm devouring their world, their thoughts did not drift toward surrender. They drifted toward sacrifice, as if sacrifice were the only language left. Shanks recognized the pattern, not from this galaxy, but from human nature wherever empires stood on fear and hope. Faith could keep a ship afloat while waves were still below deck, but faith could also pull men into storms they should have avoided. The difference was leadership. The difference was whether belief stayed a compass or became an anchor. Through the haze, he sensed the cold beacon of the trench line ahead, the same will that had held the outer wall. That mind was not shaped by sermons. It was shaped by duty distilled into something narrower and sharper than fear. Shanks did not know the colonel's name yet, but could feel that this person understood war without needing gods to justify it. A contact worth making, if only to keep the tide from wasting lives that had already spent too much. As the group moved, a wave of warp rage spilled suddenly from a distant district. Several guardsmen flinched, knuckles whitening on lasgun grips. One young trooper's breath hitched, a flash of anger rising in a way that did not belong to him. Shanks felt it, a foreign hand pushing at mortal hearts. The captain's presence pressed outward in response, subtle and cooling. Conqueror's Haki did not need to shout to counter that kind of influence. It settled like deep water, smoothing the surface, giving minds a place to stand. The trooper steadied, blinking as if waking, and continued forward without understanding why the urge to kill had faded. The Hive's civilians were worse. Inside corridors, Shanks saw families pressed against walls, faces streaked with ash, children clinging to parents who had no words left. Some stared at him with awe, others with terror, not because he looked like a saint, but because calm moving toward danger is a language people instinctively fear. Their thoughts carried no strategy, only prayers and panic. In their eyes he saw the scale of what this war meant, not a battlefield, but a slow collapse of homes, of generations, of meaning itself. Shanks did not pity them. Pity made distance. What he felt instead was the quiet resolve of a captain who cannot watch a drowning crew without stepping into the water. The world had thrown an empire's despair at him, and despair was simply another sea state to navigate. Ahead, the Manufactorum tunnels opened toward the commercial arteries leading deeper into Sanctus Var. The air there pulsed hotter, and the breath of something enormous began to gather like a storm front. Shanks sensed minds screaming in that direction, and also sensed a different presence beginning to form, vast, ancient, and laughing. The rhythm of battle was about to change again, climbing from soldiers and marines into something closer to myth. He tightened grip on Griffin, not from fear, but from readiness, and moved forward as the Hive's next nightmare rose to meet him. The commercial district had once been a canyon of trade and prayer, a place where citizens bought machine parts beneath vaulted arches carved with saints and wore banners. Now it was a killing ground. Fires ran along the avenues in long orange veins. Market stalls were flipped into jagged barricades. A train line had collapsed across 2 streets, its cars still smoldering, packed with the dead who had tried to flee. Shanks stepped into that ruin and felt the air tight into something like a held breath. The warp storm above convulsed. Its eye widened over the district with the deliberate hunger of a beast opening its throat. Reality tore again, but this time the tear was not narrow. It was a wound large enough for a god to fall through. The pressure that followed made every living mind on the street buckle. A howl rolled outward, not a sound alone, but a force of hatred that scraped at the soul. Guardsmen on rooftops dropped to one knee, lungs locking. Civilians screamed and ran with no direction. Even the cultists paused mid-chant, overwhelmed by the purity of the violence arriving. Something vast descended. A bloodthirster, brass-armored and winged, landed in the avenue as if the city were nothing but a drum to be struck. The impact cracked Ferrocrete and sent a shockwave through 3 Hive tiers. Where its feet touched, the ground bled, red liquid bubbling from cracks as though the planet itself had been wounded. Its axe was the size of a tank hull, and its whip trailed fire that ate air. The demon's eyes scanned the street, and every heartbeat it found became a promise of slaughter. Shanks watched without moving. Observation Haki tasted the creature and recoiled at the scale of it, a presence swollen with centuries of war, fed by brutality beyond counting. This was not a foe that reasoned in tactics. It was a storm given shape, an executioner made from the galaxy's worst instincts. Yet even storms had patterns, and every pattern could be met with will. The bloodthirster raised its axe and roared, a signal that tore discipline apart. Across the district, rage erupted in hearts that had been holding fear too long. Guardsmen turned weapons on each other. Civilians clawed at neighbors. The warp did not merely summon violence, it harvested it, using mortal emotion as fuel to strengthen the monster's grip on reality. Shanks felt that influence push at him like a tide of molten brass. It tried to stir his anger into something mindless, a fire without direction. But his anger had never been mindless. It was a compass, not a flood. Years of holding the sea's cruelty in one hand and a crew's trust in the other had taught him what rage was for, not to drown in, but to steer with. He stepped forward, cloak brushing ash, Griffin still low at his side. The bloodthirster turned toward him, noticing a mortal walking into its storm rather than fleeing from it. That attention was heavy, like a mountain shifting. The demon's laughter rolled through the air, a sound too large for any throat, and its shadow stretched across the avenue like a closing net. Shanks met that shadow with calm certainty. Conqueror's Haki began to rise again, deeper this time, tuned not for weak souls but for a god's wrath. The air around him cracked softly, and the district felt the arrival of another kind of pressure, colder, sharper, human, yet unwilling to yield. The space between captain and demon narrowed into a single decisive line, and the hive held its breath as the coming clash stepped beyond war and into legend. The bloodthirster lunged first, wings snapping open with a blast that scattered fire in spirals. Its axe came down fast, carried by rage vast enough to split battle tanks apart. Shanks moved before the blow reached him, not in a blur beyond sight, but with timing beyond prediction. A sidestep, a turn of shoulder, the sea-born grace of a fighter who knows that the safest place in a storm is often beside its center rather than beneath its fall. The axe cleaved empty ground, cracking the avenue so deep that molten pipes hissed below. Shanks answered with a slash across the demon's thigh. Armament Haki drove the edge in with weight that made brass hide flinch like flesh. Black-red ichor hissed onto the street, eating through the stone. The bloodthirster recoiled half a step, more surprised than wounded. Its whip lashed out, curling toward his torso like a serpent made of flame. Observation Haki read the arc. Shanks dipped under it, feet splashing through burning puddles, cloak trailing embers that died in its wake. Around them the district shook. A hab block already weakened by bombardment toppled in the distance, collapsing into a cloud of blood-colored dust. The roar of the demon stirred the warp storm overhead, and lightning crawled downward as if eager to watch. Guardsmen on rooftops tried to fire, their rounds sparking uselessly off the monster's armor. Their courage was real, their effect was not. Shanks kept walking forward between exchanges, not chasing, simply refusing to be pushed back by size or noise. Conqueror's Haki expanded in steady waves, pressing against the demon's aura like a countercurrent. The bloodthirster's rage still rolled outward, but now it met resistance. The madness in mortals nearby wavered. Some guardsmen steadied, their breath slowing. Some civilians froze mid-frenzy, blinking as the urge to kill drowned under a will stronger than the warp's provocation. The demon sensed it. Its eyes narrowed, recognizing a mortal presence that did not fracture beneath fear. The bloodthirster swung again, faster, committing more of itself, trying to end the contest through overwhelming force. Shanks met the axe head-on this time. Griffin rose, armament Haki thickening along the blade in his forearms. The clash rang out like a cathedral bell struck by thunder. For a heartbeat, steel and brass locked, and the avenue rippled under the pressure. Shanks pushed, not with raw muscle alone, but with the weight of will layered through advanced conqueror's Haki, the kind that rides through a strike and makes the world itself acknowledge a king's intent. The bloodthirster staggered, driven backward by a force that was not warp and not sorcery, only a human spirit refusing to bow. Its connection to the immaterium flickered for a breath, just long enough for the captain to slip inside its guard and carve a deeper line across its chest plate. Fire swirled around them. The district became a circle of ash, screaming metal, and broken faith. Shanks felt the heat bite skin, felt the air thicken with blood and warp sparks. Yet through it all, calm held steady in his center. This was not about proving pride. This was about stopping a storm from consuming a city that had already paid too much. The bloodthirster roared again, wounded now in more than flesh, wounded in certainty. It spread its wings wide, gathering warp energy for a killing surge. Shanks braced lightly, feet settling, blade angled forward. The next breath would decide whether a mortal captain could cut down a god of war, and the air around them grew quiet with that approaching answer. The bloodthirster charged with the full weight of its hatred, whip cracking, fire through the air, axe dragging a trail of glowing sparks. Shanks let the assault come. Observation Haki mapped the demon's intent in threaded lines. Each movement broadcast a heartbeat before it formed. The captain stepped through those lines like navigating reefs in a night storm. A pivot avoided the axe's sweep. A low slide carried him beneath the whip's bite. The ground shuddered under each missed blow, yet none found him cleanly. Armor plates on the demon's torso gaped where earlier cuts had bitten deep. Shanks targeted those seams without hesitation. Griffin flashed upward. Armament Haki drove the edge through brass and into the warp-bound core beneath. The bloodthirster hissed in outrage, not because of pain alone, but because the mortal's strikes were disrupting the binding that held its essence to reality. That disruption felt like drowning to a creature that had existed on endless violent breath. Warp rage surged outward in a desperate attempt to flood his mind. The demon wanted anger to turn sloppy, to make the sword swing wide, to make a captain forget precision. Shanks met that pressure with a colder tide. Conqueror's Haki sharpened, not expanding broadly now, but concentrating into each movement. Every step carried authority. Every cut carried the kind of will that made lesser souls drop to their knees. Even the bloodthirster felt the weight. Its swings began to fracture, not in strength, but in certainty. The demon tried to rise, wings beating to gain height for a downward slaughter. Shanks followed, leaping to a collapsed balcony with the fluid ease of someone born to moving decks. From that elevation, the captain saw the district below, fires across 16 blocks, bodies scattered in the streets, guardsmen holding like a thin ring of iron around a disaster too large for them. Their breaths were steadier now, their minds less poisoned. The duel's outcome was already changing the city's pulse. The bloodthirster launched toward him, axe high for a split that would take both balcony and man. Shanks met it in midair, blade angled not to block, but to cut. Advanced conquerors, Haki surged through the strike like thunder carried inside steel. The clash did not ring this time. It cracked. The demon's axe head fractured along the edge where Haki met warp brass, splintering in a burst of light and screaming particles. Shock flickered across the monster's face. A god of rage, realizing the weapon that had killed saints had met something it could not bully. Shanks landed lightly in the avenue as the bloodthirster stumbled. Griffin remained steady in his hand. Breath stayed slow. The creature lifted its broken axe, trying to gather warp energy to mend itself, to re-anchor its essence. Shanks did not allow the moment to stretch. A final step closed the distance. The sword rose in a clean, decisive arc aimed at the core where neck met chest, where the binding was thinnest. The cut carried no hatred, only resolve. Armament Haki drove through brass and warp sinew. Conqueror's Haki followed, crushing the demon's spirit beneath a will that refused to kneel to gods. The bloodthirster froze, eyes widening as its form began to unravel. Its roar fell into a strangled silence. Then the body broke apart into evaporating ash, essence snapping back into the immaterium like a torn sail sucked into wind. Silence flooded the district. Fires still burned, buildings still groaned, but the crushing rage had vanished. Guardsmen lowered lasguns in stunned exhaustion. Civilians blinked as if waking from a nightmare. Shanks stood alone in the settling smoke, cloak falling quiet, blade dripping ichor that steamed against the ruined street. The warp storm above seemed to recoil, not defeated, but wary, and the hive's battered heart found a fragile new breath as the captain turned toward the next shadow gathering in the distance. The bloodthirster's fall did not end with the body dissolving. Something deeper broke in the moment, its essence snapped back into the warp. The creature had arrived as a certainty, a god-shaped verdict fueled by millennia of slaughter. It had expected mortals to kneel, to rage, to feed it. Instead, it met a will that refused to be harvested. That refusal lingered in the air like a cold front after wildfire. Shanks stood in the cratered avenue, feeling the storm's pressure retreat in small ripples. The district was still a ruin, but the air no longer gnawed at the mind. Fires continued to chew through hab blocks. Sirens wailed in broken rhythms. Yet the terrible emotional gravity that had been pushing civilians into madness had lifted. Nearby guardsmen lowered weapons slowly, as if waking from a trance. Some looked at their own hands like they could not remember why they had been trembling. Others stared at the empty space where the bloodthirster had stood, unable to fit what they saw into doctrine. Observation Haki widened again, scanning the aftershock. The warp did not disappear. It recoiled, like a sea creature withdrawing a tentacle after grasping something poisonous. That recoil mattered. In this galaxy, demons were sustained not only by blood, but by the belief that they were inevitable. The bloodthirster had been a pillar of that belief, a symbol that mortals could not win this kind of confrontation without saints or superhuman armies. Shanks had cut through that symbol with sword and will alone. The damage to chaos was not just tactical, it was spiritual. A wound opened in the idea of their invincibility. Across the district, the cultists felt it first. Their chants faltered. Some collapsed as if the strings inside their minds had been cut. Others fled without knowing why, only sensing that the god they had sworn to had been forced to blink. Demons lingering in the understructures flickered and thinned, their anchor strength weakening as the emotional tide feeding them dropped. The Manufactorum lines, still corrupted, began to stutter, less eager to birth horrors where a stronger will now stood watch. Shanks moved among the settling smoke, not searching for praise, not surveying victory, only orienting to what the city needed next. The captain's calm did not come from indifference to damage, but from understanding how storms play tricks on the heart. One victory could make a man chase glory, and chasing glory was how good leaders died young. He had no interest in dying for a moment. The hive was still drowning. There were still breaches, still demonic nests, still chaos marines advancing somewhere deeper. The sea had pulled back for a breath, but the next wave was already forming. Guardsmen on rooftop lines found their discipline returning in full. Their firing drills tightened. Medici teams moved with renewed purpose. Command voxes cleared enough to pass orders without static chewing through every syllable. The battle shifted from collapse to containment, from drowning to fighting for air. It was not hope in the soft sense. It was hope sharpened into utility, the kind a soldier needs to lift a rifle again. Shanks sensed the minds watching from far away, minds that carried authority not tied to trenches or lasguns. Their attention was sharp, suspicious, and old. He did not turn toward that scrutiny yet. First came the city, then the politics. The captain wiped demon ichor from Griffin's edge with a scrap of cloak, sheathed the sword, and looked toward the upper hive where the next pressure was gathering. The night had not ended, but it had learned a new rule, and the galaxy was about to respond to that rule with teeth. The Imperium's relief never lasted unchallenged. Even as soldiers regrouped and the rage haze faded, a different kind of pressure began to settle over the district, colder than the warp, narrower than fear. Shanks felt it as layered minds approaching in disciplined formation, minds honed to interrogate anomalies until they bled truth. There was no devotion in that presence, only duty sharpened into suspicion. Dropships roared overhead, descending through the blood-red clouds with the measured confidence of forces that believed themselves the last authority on any battlefield. Their landing thrusters kicked up dust and ash, and stormtroopers emerged in clean lines, armor seals bright against ruin, weapons held with a ritual precision. Servoskulls drifted above them like silent witnesses, lens eyes adjusting to capture every angle of the red-haired stranger standing amid the rubble. At their center walked an inquisitor, tall and armored, cloak-heavy with seals that marked battles fought in shadows rather than open trenches. The woman's augmetic eye clicked as it scanned Shanks, searching for warp taint, mutation, or the telltale flares of an unsanctioned psyker. The auspex returned nothing that fit her catalog, and the absence made her posture tighten. In the Imperium, the unknown was often worse than the enemy you could label. The Inquisitor spoke with calm certainty, words steady and low, naming the authority of the Emperor and the requirement for submission. Around her, stormtroopers shifted into a shallow firing arc, doctrinally polite, practically ready. None of them had seen the bloodthirster duel with their own eyes. They only saw a human unbound by classification standing where a demon god had just died. Their minds pressed forward like a net cast to catch what should not swim free. Shanks met that approach without hostility. Observation. Haki tasted her intent. It was not personal malice. It was systemic fear, the Imperium's reflex to lock down anything that could destabilize its fragile order. He understood the instinct. Any crew that survived long enough learned to be wary of unknown currents, yet he also felt how this reflex could strangle a ship before it ever reached safe harbor. A reply came from him, measured and even. Name offered again, no kneeling, no apology. The tone was respectful without yielding ground. The Inquisitor's mind hardened at the refusal. Fingers went toward a sidearm. Orders rippled through her retinue. The moment was tilting toward violence because this empire was trained to interpret noncompliance as threat. Conqueror's Haki rose like a quiet tide, not broad, not crushing, only controlled enough to make a point. Air pressure shifted. Stormtroopers staggered a half step as if a mountain had moved closer. Some felt knees weaken before training locked them upright. The Inquisitor's breath hitched, not from pain, but from the sensation of standing under a will larger than her own. Her wards were built to slide off warp influence, and this was not warp. The realization unsettled her more than any weapon. Shanks did not advance. The captain simply held his ground, letting the weight of intent speak for him. With calm certainty, the will eased again, leaving only the dust settling between them. The Inquisitor remained standing, but her posture had changed. Authority was still there, so was caution. She now understood that forcing compliance would cost men she could not spare and might fail anyway. In that understanding, suspicion softened into a reluctant practicality. The district's sirens continued to wail behind them. The hive still burned. The Inquisitor's mission was containment, but containment meant nothing if the city fell. Shanks felt her mind making the pivot, accepting that the anomaly in front of her might be a blade the Imperium needed more than it feared. The air between them steadied, not into friendship, but into an uneasy alignment shaped by necessity, and beyond the ruined skyline, a larger shadow began to gather in orbit, pulling the story toward its next upheaval. The next upheaval announced itself through the sky. Shanks felt it first as a vast movement in the breath of the world, a tightening far above the hive that did not belong to weather or demonic tantrum. It was ordered, heavy, and hungry. The warp storm had become a beacon through the bloodthirster's death, and now the void answered. Sirens across Sanctus Var changed pitch. Vox traffic spiked into frantic bursts. The Inquisitor's retinue turned their helms upward as the clouds began to bleed fire, not from lightning but from falling steel. Chaos drop pods punched through atmosphere like burning nails, their trails painting long crimson scars across the night. The hive's void shields flickered under orbital pressure, then failed in sections, leaving whole districts exposed to bombardment that came in slow, deliberate sweeps. Far above, warships slid into real space. Their presence felt like the arrival of an old hatred. Shanks could not read the ships' names, but could read the souls aboard them. Thousands of minds, disciplined and cruel, moving with the confidence of forces that had done this before. Not a raid of cultists, not a random demonic surge, but a coordinated invasion timed to capitalize on the confusion left by the storm. The Imperial troops around him tightened formation instinctively. Their doctrine wanted an immediate counterattack, a desperate push to deny the enemy footing. Shanks watched their reflex with quiet understanding and weighed it against what he felt in the air. These were not foes that broke under blunt courage. Their intent was cold siege logic, consolidating ground, severing command arteries, turning the hive into a maze of controlled slaughter. Rushing them would be feeding the sea with bodies. Conqueror's Haki did not rise this time. It did not need to. Shanks, calm itself, became the anchor point. The captain looked to the Inquisitor, sensed the sharpness of her mind and the iron behind her authority, and spoke with steady, low certainty about positioning, about holding defensive rings, about letting the next wave reveal its shape before throwing lives into it. Her thoughts resisted for a breath, then tilted toward acceptance. The man who had cut a bloodthirster down was not guessing. The first pods hit near the governmental district, their impacts throwing up walls of rubble. From their smoking craters emerged iron warriors in heavier numbers, moving to establish firing corridors and command nodes. Their minds were colder than the squad Shanks had already killed, veterans recognizing a city as something to be dismantled piece by piece. Behind them, cultists surged like carrion following lions. Somewhere in their ranks stood a leader, a presence like a jagged iron reef, directing the tide with experience older than the Imperium itself. Shanks felt that leader's attention searching for the anomaly that had disrupted the first phase of assault. The captain did not hide from that attention. A captain did not flinch from a storm's eye. Instead, he turned toward the deeper hive roots, preparing to cut the invasion's spine before it could harden. The sword remained sheathed for now, but the will behind it was already moving into position. Around the district, Imperial morale began to stabilize again under that quiet certainty. Soldiers took up firing lanes. Skitare marched to reinforce choke points. Civilians were pushed back behind barricaded transit shafts. The hive was no longer drowning blindly. It was learning to fight with direction. Above, the warp clouds continued to burn with incoming steel. Below, the streets braced for the next collision. Shanks stepped forward into the ash wind, red hair catching ember light, and the city felt the shift as a new kind of player entered the war's deeper game. Not a saint, not a psyker, not a servant of their emperor, but a captain whose will could bend storms without becoming one. The night's rhythm tightened toward the coming siege, and the soft handoff into greater conflict settled over the hive like a tide pulling back before the next decisive wave. If you hunger for more tales of impossible encounters in the dark millennium, smash that subscribe button, and the Emperor protects those who support the channel.